The Senate will come to order, and the chaplain, Dr. Barry Black, will lead us in prayer.
Let us pray. Eternal Lord God, at a time when people expect much from their leaders, give our lawmakers the wisdom to do the work of legislation, administration, and justice for the common good. When criticism comes from those who expect miracles and look for weakness, give to the members of the Senate the grace of patience and love. Lord, brace them in your strength against the debilitating effects of frustration and futility as you infuse them with confidence in your providential power. Bless them with love, faith, and perseverance. We pray in your merciful name. Amen.
Join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Madam President, Mr. President, excuse me.
The Majority Leader, Senator from New York.
President of the Senate Pro Tem as well. Mr. President, it's my understanding that the Senate has received a message from the House of Representatives to accompany H.R. 5746.
The Senator is correct.
I ask that the Chair lay before the Senate the House message to accompany H.R. 5746.
The question is on the motion to lay before the Senate. Message from the House. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The motion's agreed to. And the clerk will report.
Resolved that the House agree to the amendment of the Senate to the bill H.R. 5746, entitled An Act to Amend Title 51 United States Code to extend the authority of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to enter into leases of non-access property of the administration with an amendment.
I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746. I move to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746 with an amendment.
The clerk will report with an amendment.
Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, moves to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment with an amendment numbered 4903.
I ask that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President, I ask for the yeas and nays on the motion to concur with an amendment.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered.
Mr. President, I have an amendment to amendment number.
To the amendment.
I have an amendment to the amendment, which is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment numbered 4904 to amendment numbered 4903.
I ask that the further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I move to refer the House message to accompany H.R. 5746 to the Committee on Rules with instructions to report back forthwith with an amendment.
The clerk will report the motion.
The Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, moves to refer the House message to accompany H.R. 5746 to the Committee on Rules with instructions to report back forthwith with an amendment numbered 4905.
I ask that further reading be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have an amendment to the instructions, which is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
The Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment numbered 4906 to the instructions of the motion to refer.
I ask that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be a sufficient second. The yeas and nays are ordered.
I have an amendment to the amendment, which is at the desk.
The clerk will report.
The Senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposed an amendment numbered 4907 to amendment numbered 4906.
I ask that further reading of the amendment be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
I send a cloture motion to the motion to concur to the desk.
Without objection, clerk will report the cloture motion.
Cloture motion, we, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a closed debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746, an act to amend Title 51 United States Code, and so forth, signed by 17 senators as follows.
I ask consent the reading of the names be waived.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. President,
Senator from New York.
before I begin the substance of my remarks, I want to offer a few words in reaction to the terrible hostage situation this weekend in Texas. Saturday's hostage crisis at Congregation Beth Israel was a horrifying reminder that the ancient poison of anti-Semitism, continues to this day. I'm relieved that all of the hostages made it out alive, and I commend the quick thinking of the first responders and of Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, who acted valiantly, and all those present for bringing this crisis to an end. Moving forward, we must get to the bottom of what inspired the terrorist attack on Saturday, but increase our vigilance against all forms of anti-Semitism and racially motivated violence. Here in Congress, we must continue working to increase our investment in nonprofit security grants to groups who are targets of hate. We need to give our communities the tools they need to protect themselves so they can live without fear of being targeted for just who they are. On this day, I stand in solidarity with the congregation of Beth Israel, the Jewish community of Greater Dallas-Fort Worth, and with all Jewish Americans for whom Saturday's attack was a traumatic reminder of the hate we have yet to overcome. President. Now, Mr. President, this is on defending democracy. The eyes of the nation will be watching what happens this week in the United States Senate. Just a few days removed from what would have been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 93rd birthday, the Senate has begun the debate on the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. For the first time in this Congress, Democrats have tried for months to hold a voting rights debate on the floor, but we have been blocked each time by Republicans. We brought common sense proposals 4 times on the floor of the Senate, and only once did one senator, Lisa Murkowski, to her credit, agree to even begin debate on voting rights. On all 3 other votes, not a single Republican joined us. Every one of them voted to block even a debate on voting rights. So today we are taking this step by using a message from the House. Now, it's just a step, but an important step moving forward in that we will finally debate this one issue that is so central to the American people, to our history, and to our democracy. As we debate these measures, the Senate will confront a critical question. Shall the members of this chamber do what is necessary to pass these bills and bring them closer to the President's desk? Today, we have just taken the first steps that will put everyone on the record. Now, much has been said over the past few days about the prospects of passing voting rights legislation in this chamber. Senate Democrats are under no illusion that we face difficult odds, especially when virtually every Senate Republican is staunchly against legislation protecting the right to vote. But I want to be clear. When this chamber confronts a question this important, one so vital to our country, so vital to our ideals, so vital to the future of our democracy, you don't slide it off the table and say, never mind. Win, lose, or draw, members of this chamber were elected to debate and to vote, especially on an issue as vital to the beating heart of our democracy as voting rights. And the public is entitled to know where each senator stands on an issue as sacrosanct as defending our democracy. The American people deserve to see their senators go on record on whether they will support these bills or oppose them. Indeed, that may be the only way to make progress on this issue now, for the public to see where each of us in this chamber stands. The public deserves to see it, and that's precisely what the Senate is going to do this week. And make no mistake about it, using Dr. King as an inspiration, Democrats will continue to fight on this issue until we succeed. And I believe history will vindicate us. Mr. President, the fight over voting rights is as old as the Republic itself. Recently, well, let me say, when the Republic was founded, in many states you had to be a white, male, Protestant property owner to vote, as is obvious by who's in this chamber. We have made progress, inexorable progress, in expanding that franchise. History does not regard those restrictions that occurred early on as worthy. But we must continue the fight. We have not reached the place where every person can vote easily and openly and honestly. So, we have to keep it up. I've been reading the biography of Ulysses S. Grant by Ron Chernow. The number one thing the Southern segregationists wanted to take away from the newly freed slaves was the right to vote. Segregationists back then knew that if recently freed black slaves didn't have the right to vote in the South, they'd have no power at all. No power over laws, over resources, over the future of the country. And that was the number one thing segregationists wanted to prevent, the right of the newly freed slaves to vote. It's why a century later, Dr. King made a direct appeal to Congress for acting on voting rights. Give us the ballot, he said in 1957, and we will no longer have to worry the federal government about our basic rights. Give us the ballot, and all other rights will follow. With the ballot, he argued, voters could end the worst of racial segregation. They could elect good men and good women to government. They could subdue the dangers of the mob and keep democracy alive. But the ballot had to come first. The ballot had to come first. Dr. King might as well have been speaking to us, because across the United States in 2022, ballot access is not being expanded, it's being repressed. And our democracy is not safe. It is under attack. A year ago, a violent mob, incited by the president and his big lie, attacked this very building in order to reverse the results of a free and fair election. Last week, for the first time, the Department of Justice announced sedition charges against a number of the rioters that were here that day. A year later, at least 19 states have passed 33 laws that make it harder for people to vote, using the big lie, as false as it is, as a justification. Those states together are home to 55 million Americans, and new laws are certainly coming once the state legislatures return to session this year. And the kind of violence, the threats of violence we saw on January 6th by that insurrectionist mob is now being threatened increasingly against countless election workers across the country. Just this weekend, the Houston Chronicle reported that, quote, county officials in urban areas across the state of Texas say they've been forced to reject an unprecedented number of mail ballot applications, thanks to the new Republican voter suppression law. And this past Saturday, Donald Trump once again repeated the same conspiracy theories about the 2020 election that have paved the way for voter suppression at the state level. So unfortunately, Mr. President, the dangers that face our democracy are alive and well, and the laws that suppress the vote at the state level are being enacted on a partisan basis. We have seen periods of regression in terms of voting rights and equality and fairness to people of color. We have seen regression occur, and this seems to be a period of regression in what the legislatures are doing, and fight it we must. So the Senate must act. We must step in and act. We must do everything to pass voting rights legislation, just as this chamber has done in the past, just as the Constitution permits us to do. That is why we will vote this week on the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And if Republicans choose to continue their filibuster of voting rights legislation, we must consider and vote on the rule changes that are appropriate and necessary to restore the Senate and make voting legislation possible. As I've recounted already, these laws are urgently needed. We cannot allow another period of that regression which we have seen throughout American history. Here's what some of the laws would do, or two laws would do. They would set basic common sense standards for all Americans for access to the ballot, as well as restore preclearance provisions that were passed by this chamber for decades on a bipartisan basis. They would establish clear and consistent standards for early voting across the country and make it easier for voters to access absentee ballots. They would protect election workers from unlawful intimidation. We are seeing so much of that now. It's disgraceful, disgraceful. They would end the toxic practice of partisan gerrymandering. And they would take new steps to fight the power of dark money, corroding our elections. Senate Democrats repeatedly tried over the last year to bring Republicans to the table to debate these issues. I will remind my colleagues that this is not the old Republican Party. I would remind the American people how dramatically the Republican Party has regressed. The Republican Party used to be one that supported voting rights. Presidents Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and George W. Bush worked to renew voting rights bills. No, sadly, unfortunately, this is Donald Trump's Republican Party. And it is the one now trying to take away the vote from younger, black and brown, elderly, minority, and low-income voters. And yet every time we tried to engage our Senate Republican colleagues, they resisted. So we have no choice. We are moving ahead on our own. Once again, no one denies the path ahead is an uphill struggle. Republicans have been clear they will entertain no bipartisan compromise on voting rights. But long odds are no excuse for this chamber to avoid this important issue. Again, members of this chamber were elected to debate and to vote. We're going to vote. We're all going to go on the record. And Republicans will have to choose which side they stand on, protecting democracy or offering their implicit endorsement of Donald Trump's big lie. For months, Senate Republicans have come up with excuses and subterfuges to avoid doing what they know is the right thing, just like so many others have come up with similar lame excuses and subterfuges in the past. But as history shows, doing the right thing will eventually prevail. Justice will flow like mighty waters, as the prophet Amos has said. The direction of voting rights in America is enough to shake in the faith of even the most optimistic champion of America, of democracy. Sometimes it seems like for each step forward, the country takes 2 steps backward. But fights like this are not unusual in American history. The story of our country has been a long, arduous march towards expanding the promise of freedom for all Americans. We find ourselves in such a struggle today. Dr. King had simple, powerful advice for his followers during the moments like this. Keep moving, keep fighting. The road to justice is often painful and full of setback, but we must keep moving. We must keep moving, he said, against every obstacle and prodigious hilltop and mountain of opposition. Let nothing slow you down. And even after you cross the Red Sea only to find yourself in the desert, just keep moving forward through the wilderness. And if you will do that with dignity, he said, when the history books are written in the future, the historians will have to look back and say, there lived a great people. We will keep fighting in the same spirit to protect our democracy in this day and age. If we do that, I have faith that one day the history books will likewise look back on this generation of Americans and conclude there lived a great people too. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I applaud the remarks of our distinguished majority leader, and I know it comes from the heart because what he is saying publicly, he's also always said both publicly and privately. And I also join with him in the condemnation of the attack in the synagogue this weekend. I know in my state of Vermont, the faith community, the Jewish, Protestant, Catholic, all came together with prayers for the safety of the people in the synagogue. But more than just the safety of what happened then, let us pray, all of us, whatever faith we have, that such attacks do not continue in our country. We've seen too many attacks against people based on their religion, or based on their race, or based on their country of origin. That's wrong. In this country, this country especially. I was thinking of this when I led the Senate this morning in the Pledge of Allegiance, and I thought, one nation, under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. Well, it's a constant battle to make sure there's that liberty and justice for all, and we have to do that. And that leads us to where we are today, Mr. President. We have got to stand up and say people can vote. I remember being here and present when the Voting Rights Act was signed by President Reagan, President George H.W. Bush, and President George Bush. I remember the pleasure on their face, the look of everybody around them, Republicans and Democrats, applauding the president for signing that legislation. And why do they applaud? Why did Republicans and Democrats applaud? Because we'd all voted for it. Because we all believed in a person's right to vote. You know, Mr. President, I'm the only Democrat ever elected to the U.S. Senate in the state of Vermont. And I remember my first two elections, which were quite close. 90%, I would say approximately 90% of the election machinery, those who count the ballots and whatnot, were controlled by Republicans. But I had faith in getting through because I knew two things. One, they could count, and two, they were totally honest. And while I'm sure, especially in the first election, the vast majority of them voted for my opponent, an honorable person, they counted the ballots, and they said where we were. So much so that there was a recount in my second election. Is so close, and I remember one of the Republican lobbying groups sent out a fundraiser saying we have to fight the Democratic-controlled election machinery of Vermont. And I reminded them the election machinery were 250 town clerks, 80 to 90% of whom were Republicans. And I said again, they can count and they're honest. We're fortunate in our state that we encourage everybody to vote. And I remember when the senators, the other party at a judiciary committee said, well, you want to change the rules so the Democrats would win. I said, well, you want nationally the kind of rules we follow in Vermont. And by the way, last year's election, we elected a Republican governor and a Democratic lieutenant governor. Why? Because our rules do not favor one party over the other. Our rules favor one thing, the right to vote. And we insist on that in our state of Vermont, but we should insist on that throughout the country. It should not be a case where somebody can be blocked from voting because the voting booths and the places for them are changed so that some communities would have a harder time or a more difficult time to come there, or hours change. No, we should be fighting. If we want America to be the strong, great nation that we all claim it is, and we all believe it is, and we all want it to be, it can only be if we say, make sure everybody gets to vote. Everybody. I don't care who they're voting for. Make sure everybody can vote. Because what happens when people are blocked from voting and voting drops off, people lose faith in their government. If we lose faith in our government, we lose faith in our country. We lose faith in our country, this wonderful experiment in democracy, as some called it a couple hundred years ago, fails. We can't have that, Mr. President. We can't have that. So I look back my 48 years here in the Senate. And I think of, it's not the titles, it's not the chairmanships, it's not the president pro tem, it's not being dean of the Senate that I cherish. It's knowing that I can vote. I can vote. I voted 17,000 times, more than that now. Can I go back over all those votes and find something where I might think, gee, I should have voted differently? Of course I can, but I voted. I could vote. Then I'd call on my colleagues, vote up or down. I would hope that all of us would do as we have in the past when I've been in the Senate. When we passed Voting Rights Act 98-0, when Republican presidents were signing the Voting Rights Act, let's go back to that time. Vote any way you want in a presidential election. Vote any way you want in gubernatorial, congressional, and local elections. But in this body which should be the conscience of the nation, vote to uphold the right to vote. Vote to allow every American the ability to vote. Don't hide behind procedure. Stand on the floor. Have the courage and the honesty to say, I'm going to vote to allow people to vote, or I'm going to vote not to allow people to vote. But stand here and say what you're going to do. The last time 98 of us stood here and voted, we want everybody to vote, Republicans and Democrats. We joined together. Wouldn't that send a wonderful signal to a fractured nation if we did that today and stood up and said, we're going to vote. We're all going to vote. We can vote yes or no, but we're going to let people of our state know how we voted. We're going to let the American people know how we voted. We can say why we voted. I would wish we voted as we did before, to say to all Americans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, any part of this country, we want you to vote. We'll urge you to vote the way we'd like, but we want you to have the ability to vote even if you're voting for our opponents or for a different point of view. The most important thing as Americans, as United States Senators, is to say we stand for the right of people to vote. Every one of us, every single one of us. Mr. President, I have more to say on this matter later, but I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
President,
Senator from Hawaii.
I ask unanimous consent to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection. Under the previous order, the leadership time is reserved. Under the previous order, the Senate will be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each.
Mr. President,
Senator from Hawaii.
yesterday we celebrated Martin Luther King Jr. Day and honored civil rights leaders who fought against inequality and sacrificed so much to move our country closer towards justice for all. But this year, on a day when we should be coming together to commemorate these civil rights achievements and recommit to the road ahead, we are instead fighting a battle we thought was won decades ago. In 1957, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "Give Us the Ballot" address, where he said, quote, "The denial of this sacred right is a tragic betrayal of the highest mandates of our democratic tradition," end quote. But here we are in 2022, fighting back against hundreds of bills introduced in states across the nation, clearly intended to make it so much harder for certain people to vote. 22 states have already enacted 47 new laws that make it more difficult to vote by mail, that make it harder to stay on voting lists, that limit the availability of drop boxes for ballots, that limit the number of polling locations, that impose stricter or newer voter ID requirements. And the list goes on. But one of the most insidious is Georgia's law, which allows any person to challenge the rights of an unlimited number of voters to cast their ballots. If someone decides for whatever reason to challenge another person's right to vote, the voter then has to show up to their election office to defend themselves. Imagine being a single mom working 2 jobs and unable to afford childcare, and now she has to defend her constitutional right just because someone thought she shouldn't be voting at all? Volunteers are already being recruited to pose these challenges. This isn't voter protection. This is vigilantism. These laws are clearly intended to target communities of color and make it harder for them to vote, period. Our country's legacy of racial discrimination in voting is undeniable, and it's undeniable that we are witnessing history repeat itself. In 1890, the House passed historic legislation that would have increased voting protections, particularly for Black voters. But the Senate failed to take up this legislation, failed to act at a critical time when it had the chance. And the results were devastating for decades to come. The Senate's failure to take up this legislation allowed Jim Crow and the plummeting of voter turnout among Black voters to continue for more than a century, until the Senate passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, over 70 years later. A recent Washington Post analysis said this current wave of voter suppression bills potentially amounts to, quote, the most sweeping contraction of ballot access in the United States since the end of Reconstruction, end quote. Today, these attacks on our freedom to vote are taking us back to the time of Reconstruction. We cannot wait another 70 years for the so-called deliberative body to act, which is why we need to pass comprehensive voter protection legislation. But not a single Republican supports the Freedom to Vote John Lewis Act. Many of my Republican colleagues have joined Congressman John Lewis to commemorate the march from Selma to Montgomery. But today, They won't even allow the Senate to consider legislation named in his honor and have called this bill radical. There is nothing radical about protecting a person's freedom to vote. What's radical is sending us back to the days of Reconstruction. This legislation would restore and strengthen the Voting Rights Act, which Congress reauthorized with broad bipartisan support 5 times in 1970, 1975, 1982, 1992, and it passed 98-0 in 2006, which included 10 currently sitting Senate Republicans. This bill would also expand opportunities to vote, prevent voter suppression, and improve election security. We're talking about provisions that would require states to offer early voting and no excuse vote by mail, make Election Day a public holiday, crack down on voter intimidation, and require post-election audits. Again, I ask, how is any of this radical? What's radical is justifying overt attacks on our democracy by perpetuating the big lie of mass voter fraud. For Republicans, this fight isn't about election security. It's about securing their power, because Republicans have decided that spreading misinformation and rigging elections by preventing people from voting is the only way they will retain their power. Republicans should come to the Senate floor and tell the American people why they won't protect our freedom to vote. Instead, the Republican leader came to the floor to attack Democrats for fighting to change Senate rules to pass this critical legislation, calling it a power grab. The Republican leader said that Democrats want to, quote, permanently damage this institution, end quote. He went on to say the filibuster is, quote, about compromise and moderation, end quote. This from the Republican leader who refers to himself as the Grim Reaper, as he prevents dozens of House-passed bills from being considered on the Senate floor. The same person who single-handedly prevented President Obama from filling a vacancy on the Supreme Court for over a year, denying the will of nearly 66 million Americans who voted to give President Obama a second term in office. The same person who pushed through President Trump's Supreme Court nominee as over 159 million Americans were in the process of voting. So much for compromise and moderation. Let's not pretend this is about the sanctity of this institution. We cannot sit back and let one political party continue to unravel the threads of our democracy, one voter suppression bill at a time. While Republicans do nothing to protect our freedom to vote in the face of mass voter suppression bills enacted across the country, we Democrats cannot sit back and let 2020 be the last free and fair election in our country. If we don't protect the right to vote, we won't have a democracy. It's that simple. That's the reality. Since the Republicans will not lift a finger to protect voting rights, we have no option but to change the Senate rules in order to pass the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act. This is something that every single Democratic senator needs to get on board with. Mr. President, I yield back.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.
Mr. President.
Republican Leader.
Ask consent that further proceedings on the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Late last week, our Democrat colleagues briefly paused their quest to destroy the Senate's 60-vote threshold, just long enough to use the 60-vote threshold themselves to block a bill. Every Republican supported sanctioning the Nord Stream 2 pipeline that will give Russia even more leverage to bully Europe. Most of our Democratic colleagues bowed to the furious lobbying from the Biden administration to protect Putin's pipeline. There were 55 votes to pass the bill that our friends like Ukrainian President Zelensky desperately wanted passed. But Democrats blocked it by denying 60. Now, many of these same colleagues have spent weeks thundering, literally thundering, that the Senate's 60-vote threshold is an offensive tool of obstruction, a Jim Crow relic, declaring that simple majorities should always get their way. But late last week, they literally wielded the 60-vote threshold themselves, a useful reminder of just how fake the hysteria has been. We already knew Washington Democrats don't have any principled opposition to Senate rules. Democrats repeatedly filibustered the CARES Act in March of 2020 while insisting on changes. Democrats filibustered and killed Senator Tim Scott's police reform bill. You only have to go back a few years to read vigorous defense of the filibuster from our Democratic colleagues and their allies. The Democratic whip, Senator Durbin, put it this way: we need to protect the right of debate in the Senate, preserve checks and balances so that no one party can do whatever it wants. We need to preserve the voice of the minority in America. Dick Durbin, the Democratic leader himself, said in 2017 that we need to, quote, find a way to build a firewall around the legislative filibuster. Build a firewall around the legislative filibuster. And in a letter that same year by 32 Senate Democrats, our colleagues demanded that the 60-vote threshold stay right where it was. So until the last couple of years, senators on both sides have understood the Senate is not here to rubber stamp massive changes by thin majorities. This institution exists to do exactly the opposite, to make sure major laws receive major buy-in and have major staying power. And historically, Democratic allies outside this chamber have recognized this as well. So let's go back about 15 years ago, when Republicans controlled the Senate. A left-wing organization called the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights published a lengthy statement defending the filibuster, including, listen to this, including its relationship to civil rights. So here's what they had to say when Republicans were in the majority here in the Senate. On behalf of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights, the nation's oldest, largest, and most diverse civil and human rights coalition, with more than 180 member organizations, we urge you to oppose any efforts to eliminate the 216-year-old filibuster in the United States Senate. That's a coalition of 180 member organizations called the Civil and Human Rights Coalition. They went on. The elimination of the rights of the minority as embodied by the filibuster is contrary to the Founding Fathers' vision of the Senate as a body of equals designed to protect against the tyranny of the majority. The statement continued. The civil rights community has recognized and accepted the value of the filibuster even when it frustrated efforts to advance civil rights legislative goals. During the 1950s and 1960s, countless civil rights bills were filibustered. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was not passed until it survived 75 days of the longest filibuster in history and the Senate voted 71 to 29 to end debate and finally passed the bill. This legislation was enacted because of long, hard work to build support across partisan, ideological, and regional lines. We work to bring Americans together, not to push them farther apart. They conclude, we never demanded the end of the system of checks and balances. In the end, we won the battle by changing votes and not by breaking the rules. These, Mr. President, were left-wing activists writing less than 20 years ago. So let's spell this out. Democrats want the American people to believe the filibuster was not a Jim Crow relic in 2005, was not even a Jim Crow relic in 2020. Just miraculously became a Jim Crow relic in 2021. Briefly stopped being a Jim Crow relic last Thursday, but it's now back to being a Jim Crow relic this week. Now, to be clear, the partisan election takeover bills that Democrats want to ram through this week are not in any way successors of the civil rights legislation from the mid-20th century. It has been, is today, and will remain illegal to discriminate against voters anywhere in America because of their race. Period. That's the law. Now, targeting Americans' online speech and sending government money to political campaigns is not about civil rights, it's about tilting the playing field. Weakening widely popular voter ID laws and making it harder to produce accurate voter rolls is not about making voting easier, it's about making cheating easier. Changing the law so that our partisan attorney general can rewrite laws without even having to win in court is not about promoting justice. It's about short-circuiting justice. This is about one party wanting the power to unilaterally rewrite the rule book of American elections. Now, interestingly, the Biden administration staff have gone out of their way lately to highlight my long, strong record on real civil rights and real voting rights. The President's secretary explained that I have, quote, a pretty strong record of supporting voting rights. She's right about that. And that's exactly why I have no patience, none, for the unrelated partisan takeover that some Democrats are trying to rebrand with that banner. The Democratic leader argues that his proposed elections takeover and his efforts to break the Senate are last resorts because of new state laws that passed in 2021. He says it's irrelevant that 2020 saw record turnout, and listen to this, 94% said voting was easy because this debate is exclusively about what happened in 2021. But Democrats have been pushing these same policy charges and the same Chicken Little rhetoric since 2019, a year and a half before the 2020 election, which Democrats now call a high turnout success. The Democratic leader gave an interview claiming that evil Republicans are trying to attack voting and disenfranchise people. Of course, when Democrats went on to win the White House, the 2020 election went from presumptively illegitimate to exemplary and unquestionable overnight. Around the same time, mid-2019, Senator Schumer began floating a nuclear attack on Senate rules. This is completely untethered from the elections issue. He just thought breaking the rules would make for a livelier stint as majority leader. Washington Democrats have wanted the power to rewrite the rules for political speech and election laws long before the events that are supposed to justify it. And the Democratic leader's effort to break the Senate long predates the latest pretext. We have strong disagreements about the substance of these bills, but even more broadly, we see decreasing trust in our democracy among both political sides. We have a sitting president of the United States shouting that United States senators are on the side of Bull Connor and Jefferson Davis for refusing to shatter the Senate. Was the Senate created to make these kinds of factional fevers worse? To help break the fevers, to help break the fevers. Does the Senate exist to help narrow majorities double down on divisions or to force broad coalitions to build bridges? This fake hysteria does not prove the Senate is obsolete. It proves the Senate is as necessary as ever. Republicans have supported this limitation on the majority's power, both when we've been in the minority, which these rules protect, and when we've been the majority, which they inconvenience. And last week, some of our colleagues across the aisle reconfirmed they have the courage and the principle to keep their word and to protect the institution as well. But too many of our colleagues across the aisle still want to respond to a 50-50 Senate with a rule-breaking power grab. Voting to break this institution will not be a free vote or a harmless action, even if their effort fails. An unprincipled attempt at grabbing power is not harmless just because it fails. Voting to break the Senate is not cost-free just because a bipartisan majority of your colleagues have the wisdom to stop you. It's amazing that our colleagues are this enthralled to radical activists. We have inflation, a pandemic, rampant violent crime, a border crisis, and possibly a war on the European continent. But rather than work on any of that, Senate Democrats want to mar their own legacies with a reckless procedural vote they know will fail. A faction this desperate for unlimited short-term power is a faction that must be denied it.
Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I care about the future of this institution, but right now I care more about the future of our democracy. Our country has been the bedrock for democracies around the world. It has been the gold standard by which other countries wishing to achieve transparency and validation of their governments have asked us to come and witness their elections. Let's not forget what is great about a democracy. The power rests with the people. And when you have an election, it's the people who have spoken. So whether it was FDR in the New Deal or Ronald Reagan declaring mourning in America, the people had spoken and the country went about the change that was implemented because of free and fair elections. Trust me, there are countries who are jealous of this. They obviously run their countries by other means. They are less stable and they are less egalitarian. And yet, if we think of the many great advantages of a democracy, nothing says it better than the people have spoken. Yet now, we have a former president of the United States, Donald Trump, who has dared to say and continues to say, the people haven't spoken. Donald Trump is not just like the guy at a football game who doesn't like the referee's calls. Donald Trump has taken it to a whole new level of basically, without evidence, saying his team didn't lose the game. Can you imagine NFL or college football structure where the coach says, I don't like the ref's call, my team didn't lose the game, and I'm going to spend the rest of my time going marching around to every football game and every community saying, my team didn't lose the game. Well, thank God college and professional coaches know better. They don't do this. And yet, former President Trump keeps saying, I don't like the call of election officials, judges, federal courts. Never mind, there were 60 decisions by different courts. I'm going to protest the outcome of this election. Never in the history of our country do I know a major race where someone declared they really didn't lose. What if everybody went around saying, I really didn't lose? What if our system of governments would be affected by that? Well, Madam President, it is getting to that level of absurdity. The Republican nominee in the 2020 Washington gubernatorial election lost by over 600,000 votes, yet he claimed voter fraud. He lost by 56 to 43, and even though he lost by such a huge margin, he claimed voter fraud. He sued the Secretary of State, who happened to be a Republican, in King County Superior Court. He only dropped the election fraud lawsuit after the court threatened his lawyer with making meritless claims. Do we really understand this danger? The danger of people in our country, to our economy, to our way of life, if these falsehoods continue? We're not here, though, just because a former president cannot accept an election loss. He began sowing these seeds of distrust into our election system the minute he stepped onto the national stage. We're here because the problem has become so serious that people are now trying to disenfranchise the voting rights of our fellow Americans. Some voter suppression tactics are being put in place because some believe the former president did not like the outcome of the election. I want to be clear, there are people on both sides of the aisle that do believe in free and fair elections. There are Republicans in key election positions who stood up to the illegal tactics of the president when he tried to change the outcome of the last election. But what our country can't afford right now is the continuation of Trumpthink to allow to erode the voting rights of our fellow Americans. Voting rights have been hard fought and hard won. I know the president presiding understands this. First by women in 1920, then later protecting minority groups in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. In 1970, we updated it, making standards, helping to regulate presidential elections. In 75, saying we had to protect other minorities. Both sides of the aisle agreed to this. And in 1992, we expanded for bilingual education requirements. That passed with 75 to 20 votes. And again, in 2006, the last time the voting rights was updated, we were in a similar situation. The Supreme Court had had 2 cases and struck down part of the act, and we all came together to renew and reaffirm the constitutional protections for people in the United States of America. It passed 98-0. There is nothing wrong with the John Lewis voting rights law before us. There's nothing wrong with the John Lewis voting rights law before us. It is a bill with bipartisan support that tries to maintain, I think, a federal minimum assurance that states don't suppress the rights of our fellow Americans. When Martin Luther King was fighting this fight, he said, "One man, one vote." He knew that this was about making sure that everybody had a chance to vote. The John Lewis Act is a continuation of those rights and upgrading something that has been upgraded numerous times since 1965. And that is why my colleagues, Senator Manchin and Murkowski, called for bipartisan reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. Bipartisan call for reauthorization last spring of the Voting Rights Act. They said, quote, "Inaction is not an option," end quote. They continued to say, quote, "Congress must come together just as we have done in the past, time and time again, to reaffirm our longstanding bipartisan commitment to free, accessible, and secure elections." And that is what we must do now. That is why there are 150 businesses who support the John Lewis Act. Companies like Microsoft and Google and Intel and Pepsi and Tesla, Sealaska, Target, PayPal. These are companies who know and understand they want to do business in a democracy. As Tim Cook said, the right to vote is fundamental to our democracy. American history is a story of expanding the right to vote to all citizens, and Black people in particular have had to march, struggle, and even give their lives for more than a century to defend that right. And we support efforts to ensure that our democracy and our future is more hopeful and inclusive than the past. There are others. Best Buy: "An election cannot be free or fair if every eligible voter is not given a full chance to vote, or if the law makes it harder to do so." Now, Madam President, I disagree with my colleague who was just on the floor, because there is a lot of demeaning of the system. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it now because I have another segment here on the floor later. But I come from a vote-by-mail state, and I am proud of what our state has accomplished. So I do not appreciate the disinformation of Newt Gingrich when he says, quote, "The biggest way to expand voter fraud is to expand vote-by-mail." He's wrong. If I could slash a red line and a red circle through this now, Madam President, I would do so. But I will spend many minutes later on the floor talking to people why vote by mail is part of the solution and not the threat that he thinks it is. Companies know that when it comes to our economy, we're greatly aided by being in a democracy. And that is why they don't want it eroded. It will cost us if we're a less stable place to do business. So why now do people refuse to engage on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act? You know, I might be one of those people who would say, don't change the filibuster rule, we can wait. Wait. Wait for what? What are we waiting for? Our capital was attacked. We were attacked. People defending us were killed. For what? For what? A big lie. A big lie about our election. I sat outside the Capitol on January 6th and listened to the president telling these lies I knew weren't true. I knew what he said wasn't correct about our voting laws because I know and understand them, and I certainly know vote by mail. But he said many lies that now many court decisions have all said are not true. But the point is that Donald Trump and his followers keep following, and they tell the people the election wasn't fairly decided. And now they're trying to pass state laws eroding our constitutional rights to protect every American's ability to vote. And some here don't want to act. Our democracy is under threat, and people are trying to undermine the credibility of our elections, and you don't want to act. Trump supporters are literally trying to hoist a Jolly Roger flag over our democracy because they lost the election, and some people don't want to act. Some percentage of the Republican Party now believe that the election was wrongly decided, and some people don't want to act. Madam President, we have to have faith in close elections, and the best way to do that is not to suppress the vote, but encourage and empower more people to vote in a safe and secure manner. We need to believe in our voting system, not believe that we can undermine it. Democracies don't grow on trees. They need to be protected. They need to be defended. They need to be fought for. And with all the challenges we're facing, COVID, a changing economy in an information age, global migration, climate change, I'm getting too many questions from my constituents about whether we're becoming a fascist nation. Why am I answering those questions? Because Trump told a big lie and he got people to attack our Capitol, and now he's ramping up fear and anxiety to the point where locals are changing their election laws and eroding our democracy? No, I can't stand by. I will vote to proceed and change. I will not stand by because my parents taught me better. My father fought in World War II and reminded me constantly when I was growing up that if someone's rights were eroded, you better stand up, because if you don't, they're coming after your rights next. And a threat to one was a threat to all. My mom worked at the polls on Election Day. When she was a child, she played in her backyard and met an African-American woman who became her friend. When Election Day rolled around, my mom noticed that her friend had to wait outside in the cold to vote, where the white voters got to go inside and wait. My mom took her friend by the hand inside the polling place and said, "My friend's not waiting outside." It earned my mom the nickname Little Eleanor, after the First Lady of the period. What might seem surprising is how much my mom liked her fellow Republican precinct committeemen. She felt like they were on the same team, team democracy, people who got the vote out. They may not agree on who they were voting for, but they agreed people should vote, and they were willing to live with the consequences. And believe me, my parents had a lot of things that they had to keep fighting for, but they believed in democracy. I remember my mom saying how uneasy she felt when she realized her friends and neighbors, seeing the results of her precinct, didn't support John Kennedy for President of the United States. My parents were crushed when John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were all assassinated. But they never lost faith in the system, and they never said the system was rigged. What we need to do now is to protect our democracy. We need to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. We need to say, as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, that one man, one vote is what our country stands for, and it is the strength of our nation. One thing about January 6th bothers me the most. It bothers me the most because I think about my father and his brother. My father quit high school to fight in World War II because his brother was already missing or in a POW camp. He knew he had to join the fight against the oppressions, the tyranny, the fascism that existed. He knew he had to join the fight to uphold the democracy of the United States. This is a picture of what it looked like to be escorted back into this chamber on January 6th. All I could think of when I saw this picture is obviously, yes, support and gratitude for the military who supported us. But all I could think about was my father and his brother who fought in World War II for these rights to uphold a democracy so that I could stand for election and that my friends and neighbors could vote for me. And then I would come here in an environment where I was free to walk into the Capitol at any moment and cast a vote on behalf of the people that I represent. And yet, on one fateful day, that all changed. And we were no different than some other country who had to use military force to support our democracy here in voting. Madam President, that's not the way it's supposed to be. That's not what we're fighting for. Many Americans have fought to uphold the democracies of our nation. The least we could do is pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. The least we could do is work in a mission together to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and show that our country believes in holding these important values of a democracy as utmost important. Let's vote to get this done. Let's move forward to show our country we believe in voting rights in the United States Senate. I thank the President, and I yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Democrats have shamelessly alleged that a massive federal takeover of elections is needed because of questions some Republicans raised after the 2020 election. So I come to the floor today to show that this whole argument predates the 2020 election. This Democrat reasoning is despite the fact that their proposal predates the 2020 election. The bill that they want us to pass is a product of concerns that the Democrats had about the 2016 election being stolen from Hillary Clinton, also because of the 2018 elections, and in fact, the Democrat proposal was designed specifically to double down on false claims that Democrats lost certain elections in 2018 only because of rigged elections. I've said it before, and I want to say it again. Evidence-free claims of voter suppression are as bad as election-free claims of voter fraud. Both voter fraud and discrimination in voting is illegal. Any claim of voter fraud or violation of voting rights should be resolved in our independent court system with evidence that can stand up in the courts. And as I've mentioned before, the claims by some Trump supporters that certain brand of voting machines switch votes was lifted entirely from the Democrats' 2004 playbook, and you may remember that Democrat House members challenged the electoral vote count of whether George W. Bush was officially and honestly reelected. And President Trump's questioning of his loss in Georgia was simply following in the footsteps of the losing Democrat candidate for governor of that state just 2 years before, who lost a much bigger margin and never admitted that defeat. That makes me wonder if Democrats' professed outrage comes from a sincere concern for democratic reforms, or if they're just upset that President Trump stole their playbook. If Democrats really want to preserve democratic norms, they would not be proposing a federal government overturning the current electoral process in all 50 states on purely partisan basis with no attempt to even hear out Republicans' legitimate concerns. The bills that we're talking about this week are being called democracy reform. Does democracy need reform? I support the American democratic system. It does not need a fundamental rewrite. 240-year history of our great country under this Constitution ought to support that. It works, and it deserves our support. We should not denigrate American democracy for short-term political gain. President Trump's candidacy in 2016 brought many Americans to the polls who had not voted recently, and there was a record turnout. In 2020, turnout broke the record yet again, both for the Republican Party and the Democratic Party, and President Biden won that election. In the 2021 election, there were unusually high turnouts for off-year elections to the benefit of Republicans and conservatives. You saw that, particularly in the state of Virginia, where the Republican candidates statewide were victorious, and you saw some surprising turnouts of opposition to Democrats that were reelected in the state of New Jersey. Democrats accused Republicans of wanting to keep people from voting. Why would we want to keep people from voting when we have been very successful in many large turnout elections very recently? Plus, have you seen the polls today that shows dissatisfaction with Democrats, a Republican deficit of 5 or 7 points last year, with a positive Republican versus Democrat polls this year? So we ought to stop casting doubt about American elections. Stop casting aspersions on common sense election security measures like ID supported by overwhelming numbers of Americans of all backgrounds. And by all backgrounds, I mean even people that we classify as minorities, let's work together to boost the confidence of all Americans in our elections. Let's start rejecting claims. That only way that the other party can win is by rigging elections. Let's retire the short-term.
You're hearing about around the United States of America is about limiting vote by mail. It's about trying to stop it or slow it down or raise accusations about how it doesn't work. And part of the initial establishment of pre-clearance in the United States in the 65 Voting Rights Act was about the great disparity that existed in the United States between states, that some states had very different turnouts than other states in a presidential election, maybe 20 or 30% different. And so people were starting to say, how are you affecting us if some states aren't really empowering their citizens to vote, and the consequences is suppressing voter activity? So I definitely believe in the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. I definitely believe that starting in 1965, we had disparity in states in the way they voted, and we did something about it. And we did something about it because people were being discriminated against, and that was the premise of the law. Stop the discrimination. Stop the discriminatory tactics that states were using to discriminate against people so that their votes couldn't be cast. And now we've updated that law many times over the last several decades in a bipartisan fashion, most of the time signed into law by Republican presidents. So I don't get the stumbling block here. I don't get the stumbling block why people won't come to the table and help us write the next version of the 1965 Civil Rights Act that is just called the 2022 Civil Rights Act. I don't get it. I don't get why people aren't coming to the table to do that. But I know this, that one of the big lies out there, and the Republicans, I see my colleague was here from Alaska, and I do feel a great unity. People may not understand the relationship between the state of Alaska and the state of Washington, but it's a very true affinity. We come from the same part of the world. Our economies are integrated. We have many people who live in both places. We share commonality of culture, of our environment. And my colleague from Alaska was here talking about their vote-by-mail system. And so the fact that people are telling lies and trying to suppress the vote by suppressing vote-by-mail or calling it fraudulent is very frustrating. It's very frustrating, and it's one of the reasons we should come together in a bipartisan way and support vote-by-mail. We should be empowering people, particularly in a pandemic, to cast a vote so that we know their vote is counted, so we can have confidence that we had an election and that the people spoke. But here we have Newt Gingrich, who has said numerous times now, the biggest way to expand voter fraud is to expand vote-by-mail. Now, he said that on Fox News. He said it's been quoted in the paper. He's not said it once. He's said it several times. Or maybe they just keep doing the same clip over and over again. And then his next line, which I didn't put on a chart, is, and the Democrats want universal access to vote by mail. Well, not sure what's wrong with vote by mail. We're going to talk about that because I'm not sure what's wrong with vote by mail. Like, seriously, I've seen it over the 20 years I've been in office, expanded in our state and in Oregon, and now used as the majority of the way that people vote. And so I don't take kindly to his comments or to the former president's comments that somehow this is a fraudulent system. It's not. First of all, I've got a lot of charts here, Madam President, so you'll have to excuse us. First of all, when you get a voter registration form for vote by mail, it says right on the form, you must be a citizen of the United States of America to vote. You must be 18 years old the next election, or 18 before the special election. That's what it says right on the form. There's no mistaking about it. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You are going to sign your name and attest to these issues. In fact, the attestation basically says knowingly providing false information about yourself or the qualifications for voter registration is a Class C felony, punishable by imprisonment or a fine up to $10,000 or both. That's a pretty hefty fine. That's a pretty serious issue. I don't think most people are going to say, oh, I want to help perpetrate voter fraud because I want to go to jail or I want to pay this fine. And the notion that somebody illegally in the United States is going to sign up for this, most of these people are just trying to earn an income and stay on a low profile. I don't think any of them, if you're an illegal immigrant and you sign up for vote by mail and you vote by mail, you will be deported. You'll be deported. So I don't think people are out there doing this voluntarily because they think this is some great way to game the system. In fact, the statistics that were just done by a major report shows that there's less than 1% of voter fraud in this system. It's not really this notion that the former president would like to perpetrate. Well, the biggest reason why vote by mail works is what's here, but you don't see it. I guess I should sign my name. Because right here, I declare the facts on this registration form are true. I'm a citizen of the United States. I live at this address for at least the last 30 days before the election which I'm going to vote in. I'm old enough to vote in that election, and I understand that under the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections, you can't currently be serving a sentence for a felony conviction or incarcerated for a federally or out-of-state federal conviction. Okay, right there, you have to sign your name right below that. So this attestation and requirement, oh, by the way, part of the requirement on the form that you get is you also have to put in your driver's license or an ID. Now, in many states, you're moving to this driver's license, enhanced driver's license requirement, which you have to prove you're a citizen of the United States. Not every application you get at a driver's license office, you have to prove that. But this is the information on your voter registration card that you have to prove that you're attesting to the fact that you are a citizen of the United States. It is information that can be searched. So now we come to the actual ballot. I don't know if we have a copy of the ballot here. Oh, well, we'll have to go grab one of those. But on your ballot, you do the same thing. You get a ballot. Your ballot has to have that signature on it. You vote who you say you're going to vote for. You put it in a privacy envelope. You stick it in another envelope, and you mail it in. So at the county auditor, they match that signature that you signed on your voter registration card with the signature on that ballot. And that is how they know you are who you say you are. Now, that's no different really from most of the way voting has worked in our country for decades. When you go into the polling place, they ask you for your name. You go to a book. If you've noticed, your name and address were there in a blank space, and they say, sign your name. Most Americans probably never noticed at the top of that page was also an attestation that said, if you're lying about who you are, yeah, you're going to pay a fine and you're going to jail. So when you went to a polling place and you signed your signature, they went back and saw if it was the signature that you had on your registration card. So vote by mail is replicating that same system. An application card matched to a signature on your ballot. And that is what happened. Now, that is not to say there isn't attempts at fraud. Not to say that there isn't attempts at monkey business, because there is. But it says the system is based on something that is safe and secure and can be validated. I'm going to shock some people, I'm sure, by saying this. But when I went to vote in the last election, somebody had requested several ballots in my name. Several ballots in my name. I'm sure it was ill intent. There was nothing good about it. And when I looked to see that they hadn't counted my ballot, even though I had voted very early in the process, I became alarmed and I called the auditor and said, why haven't you counted my ballot? And he said, several people have filed ballots under your name. I'm sure ill intent and monkey business by somebody. So I decided I'm going down to the courthouse to see what this was all about. But by the time I got there, the auditor had sorted it out and said, I found the one signature that matches your signature, and we've counted your ballot. So they hadn't done that. They probably threw it in a pile. Oh, we got 10 ballots under this name, whatever it was. Why did that happen? I don't know. But I know the system worked because he pulled them all aside, and when he got to it, they matched my name with the ballot that existed. Now, for us in Washington, because we've had some very close elections, the vote-by-mail system has got a lot of scrutiny. It got a lot of scrutiny in a governor's race a few years after I got elected, and the race got down to several hundred votes, really. I think in the end it was several hundred votes. And, you know, we had people, you know, admitting that they had voted for dead spouses. We had all sorts of things at the end when people knew that the level of scrutiny. Most elections aren't that close. But when you're down to hundreds of votes and you know that there's going to be scrutiny, the system works. It doesn't mean there won't be a mistake somewhere and that you won't have to redo the count and find it. It doesn't mean that there's absolutely 0.0000 fraud. It means that it's a system based on a safe and secure measure and that you can go back and check it. Now, I love our vote-by-mail system, and the voters are proving at 84% turnout in the last presidential election, and sometimes in off-year elections, we can get as high as a 70% turnout. So it's working in off-year elections. Who is not for empowerment and enfranchisement of people? Apparently Newt Gingrich isn't, because he thinks it's a mastermind theory or some scenario where he thinks we're going to try to take over the world, when in reality, I would just say it's the next phase of voting, particularly in an era of pandemic, and that we need to have our elections be more secure. I would say that if people are going to fool around and create distrust in your election system, having a system where you get to tear off a tab and keep it at home and know that your ballot was cast and know that you can count it and know that you can count it again. In my election, when I won by 2,229 votes, the tallies weren't the same each time. They weren't. It changed. It didn't mean they were wrong. It just meant that various mistakes were made, they verified their work, and they were corrected. But my predecessor did not undermine the United States democracy by claiming he lost. He didn't go out and try to pass voter suppression laws. He came back here and worked on the 9/11 Commission with all of us and tried to defend our country. But that's not where we are today. We're here with Mr. Trump, President Trump. And, Madam President, you know, on January 6th, I sat outside and listened to the president. I really thought, you know, I'm going to go in and give a speech that night. I had no idea what was going to happen to us. I thought I was just going to speak on the floor that night. I thought that was it. I had no idea that we were going to face an insurrection. So I was taking notes. I thought, I'm going to give this speech. Well, as it turned out, didn't get to give that speech. We had kind of a truncated session that night. We gave a few speeches, a few people talked, but we didn't give a big speech. So I've been waiting to give this speech for a long time. I've been waiting to repudiate what the president said at his rally for a long time. And the reason is because I cannot stand to have our election system, the basis of our democracy, the basis of our country, why we're the gold standard around the world. I'm not sure anybody should go on a Codell anymore to witness an election in another country until we get our election system right here. What are you going to say when you get there? What are you going to say if you're going to go to another country and witness their election? We know how to do it in the United States, because right now we're not proving that. We're showing that we can't move forward on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. But let's go over what President Trump said that night. Because President Trump claimed that, his first claim that, that the Michigan Secretary of State flooded the state with unsolicited mail-in ballots sent to everybody on the rolls in direct violation of state law. That's what he said that's what he said. That's what he said at his rally. That's what he said, go down there, go down there. You know, there's moments in this craziness. There's moments in this craziness when you realize there are people who will stand up. And I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. But I was probably the last person to leave this chamber. And the parliamentarian refused to let anyone touch the ballots. Even though she could barely walk down the hall, even though she could barely carry all those supplies, she knew that allowing anybody else to touch those certifications of the election would give somebody the claim that somehow somebody had interfered. So people were doing their job. And in this case, the Secretary of State, in response to a 2018 vote by the people of Michigan, they approved, in a vote by the people, a no-excuse absentee voting law. That's what the people of Michigan voted for. So the Secretary of State sent out ballots. Some people didn't like that. Some people challenged it. And in September of 2020, the Michigan Court of Appeals upheld the decision that the Secretary of State, citing the Constitution and their authority over elections, that they had the authority to mail those ballots. The Supreme Court of Michigan didn't take up that case. They didn't refute it. So it's false. He's trying to say mail-in ballot applications were illegally sent. It's not true. The people voted for it. The Secretary of State did her job. The courts upheld it. He tried to say 17,000 ballots were cast by deceased voters. Okay, I mean, to say nothing of the fact that there are probably a lot of people with the name of John Brown in Michigan. Like, there's lots of people by the same name. But there is a system that uses the Social Security Administration to flag death of deceased voters. And ballots in this case who have died are not counted in the Michigan election. In the state of Washington, if you cast a ballot and you mailed it and you died 2 days later and the election's not till the next week, your vote counts. Now, you can't mail it, your spouse can't mail it after you die and say, my wife intended to vote for so-and-so. No, no, no. But once you vote, once you fill the ballot out and you put it in the mailbox or a ballot box, your vote is good, even if you die the next day. That's our state. In Michigan, no. So they did not do this. They did not have this claim that the president had. And then he claimed the turnout in Wayne County was 137% of registered voters, or 139%, somewhere in there. Also not true. In Wayne County, it was 61% of the vote of more than 1.4 million registered voters. So all that he said about Michigan that night was false. It was false. And the courts upheld it. And it was just a big lie. Let's go to the president's state. Let's go to Wisconsin. Trump claimed 170,000 absentee ballots were counted without a valid absentee ballot application. Now, the president knows that your state is infamous, famous, appreciated for same-day voting. And in Milwaukee and Dane counties, a total of 170,000 people did vote absentee ballot in person in the 2020 election. They filled out an absentee ballot application, located it on the envelope like I showed, and sent in the ballot. So they know who those people are. They know that they were legitimate voters. They didn't vote without an application. They filled out the application as well. So this, too, is part of the big lie. And then Trump claimed that 100,000 ballots were backdated by U.S. postal workers. That's what he claimed. The U.S. Postal Service Inspector General investigation to the allegations, and all of the USPS workers and contractors refuted these allegations. There was no evidence. There was no evidence. There was no evidence that this occurred. And then the famous thing that the other side of the aisle constantly talks about, which I don't understand, ballot harvesting. They think that somehow this is going to lead to ballot harvesting. So Donald Trump claimed that Madison had 19,000 ballots were collected by human drop boxes. I don't even know what a human drop box is. I don't even know what he means by a human drop box or operatives. Well, facing an influx, Madison and the city clerk held a pair of events in which people could go to a park and drop off their absentee ballots at stations set up and staffed by poll workers. What is wrong with us if we're trying to make it harder to vote in America? What is the premise? If the premise is you want to certify that people are actual citizens of the United States, great, we have a system. If you want to certify they live there, great, we have a system. We have a fine, we have a penalty, we have a way to investigate them, we have a way to catch fraud. So what is it? You just want to make it harder to vote? No, no, no. Democracies are about enfranchising. It's a constant effort. The same things we did in 1920 don't apply in 2020. In 2020, it's an information age, and we had a pandemic. What is wrong with making the vote available to people? So the ballot harvesting that he claims did not happen. That's also part of his speech that night. He went on for 45 minutes. He went on for 45 minutes whipping people up to come down here and attack the Capitol based on these lies that weren't true. Big lies that weren't true. Then he went on to Georgia. He claimed over 10,000 ballots in Georgia were cast by individuals whose names and birth dates matched Georgia residents who died in 2020 prior to the election. He later revised that down. He was like, oh, wait, no, that's too high. He said it was 5,000. And the State of Election Board in Georgia conducted a comprehensive investigation of deceased voters submitting ballots and found 4 cases. 4 cases. 4 cases. Again, I don't know what Georgia's law is. I don't know if it's like Washington. I don't know if it's like Michigan's. I don't know what it's like, but they found 4 people. So it wasn't 5,000, it wasn't 10,000. Trump claimed that there were 66,000 people that were under the age of 18 who voted. I think this has gotten a lot of attention because I think there's been some public accounting of this in the press. I think the Secretary of State refuted this several times. But in general, the Secretary of State said that there were 0 individuals under the 18 who voted in the election based on a comparison of people who voted in the 2020 election in Georgia to their full birthdays. So that also was refuted. And then Trump claimed, I showed you that attestation on the Washington ballot, the certification that you have to sign, what it says. Can't vote if you're incarcerated or a felon. So Trump claimed that there were 2,500 ballots cast in Georgia by individual names and birth dates that match incarcerated felons in Georgia prison. So there was no mass incarcerated voting of felons. they did investigate and did find 74 potential felons who they think could have cast a ballot. And guess what happened? They pulled them, so they weren't counted. That's how the system works. That's how the system works. That's what you're supposed to do. That's why you have the system. So just like the other states, no, those voter claims were false. Okay, let's go to Arizona. Also another claim. He's made a lot of claims since then, but I'm just focusing on the ones mostly from that evening, because that's what sent people down here, and now that's what sent us on where we are with candidates all across America pledging Trump-think to run for office, which is undermining our election system and undermining our democracy. And all I want is our colleagues to work together on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. That's all I want. Like, this can't be more tumultuous than 1965. Well, I'm not saying that he isn't, the former president isn't stirring up a lot. He is, but I got to believe that we can work together. So he said 36,000 ballots were illegally cast by non-citizens. Madam President, why am I going through this? Because I get a little tired of everybody just saying, oh, the courts decided, he was wrong, the courts decided, he was wrong. No, no, no. People need to have faith in this system. We need to work to build faith in this system. We need to work in a bipartisan fashion to build faith in this system. And we need to stop the discrepancies between states. 2020 turnout in Washington for presidential, 84%. Alaska, 60%. West Virginia, 63%. Georgia, 66%. Wisconsin, 72. I don't know. I think it's probably a little higher. I don't know. Pre-clearance was based on that there was 20% difference in states voting. That 20% difference still exists today. How are we working to protect our democracy and enhance voting rights if we're here trying to suppress those rights through these various state actions? So in Arizona, the president said 36,000 ballots were illegally cast by non-citizens. Well, I showed you that attestation that you have to sign that basically says you're going to jail or you're going to be deported or you're going to pay a fine. And in Arizona, the Supreme Court basically had previously struck down a law requiring that proof. And so they did submit proof of their application. They do submit and attest to their citizenship. So they do attest to their citizenship, and since then, Arizona has further enhanced their laws. 22,000 ballots were returned that were scheduled to be mailed out. I love this all the time. I love this all the time, like this notion that somehow somebody leaked a bunch of ballots as if they all don't have a barcode on them. They all have a barcode on them, that you know where they are, they have a number attached to them. But because we have so many people who vote overseas or who vote even here in the Washington, D.C. area, some of my staff here get a ballot earlier than I would get a ballot at my home in Edmonds, Washington. And the reason is because they know that they live here and it takes them a long time to get the ballot and get it back to the Secretary of State. So they were probably referring to ballots that were being mailed out. The claim was really just a misreading of data, that parties that mailed in the ballot on the first day that literally could have been overseas ballots before the ballots actually went out because a previous batch of ballots were already sent. There was a claim that there were more than 11,000 ballots cast, the numbers of registered voters in the same state. In the 2020 election, the Secretary of State reported 3.4 million votes were cast out of 4.3 million registered voters for a turnout of 79%. So there weren't more, there might have been at some moment I mean, one of the things that you see in close elections, particularly in our state, because it takes a long time to count vote by mail, because again, you're doing the verification of signatures, is counties will list how many ballots that they have left. No county ever overestimates how many ballots they have. They don't know because you're still getting them in because of the vote by mail. Nobody says they have more ballots than they do, because then everybody's going to say, where are those ballots? So people underestimate the number of ballots, and the consequence is you have different numbers that come in every day. Doesn't mean there's something wrong with the system. The system, again, based on your signature, on your registration, on your attestation. Again, it's not to say that there won't be less, than a decimal percent of 1% fraud. There will be some things that happen, but it's not pervasive to the system, and there is a way to catch them. There was a way to penalize them. And 150,000 voters were registered in Maricopa County without voter registration deadline after the deadline had passed. And a federal judge basically in that case cited the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and there were 20,000 ballots that basically were registered after October 5th. So the court legally extended that deadline because of COVID-19. So the notion that these were all illegal, you may not have liked the court decision. I know the former president doesn't like the court decision, but these are what the courts decided in these cases. These are what voters decided. These are what states decided. He just doesn't like the outcome of this system. And the reason why we're here today on the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and to try to pass these laws is because our country, based on a democracy, knows that enfranchisement, voter enfranchisement, is something that we have to constantly be working for. I talked about a couple of companies earlier, but I'd like to talk about a few more if I could. The reason I'm saying this is because right now we need to unite the free press, the business community, the general public, everybody we can to say, let's get behind free and fair elections, let's get behind the verification of this system, and let's strengthen the democracy we have in the United States of America. But what did Best Buy say? They support the John Lewis Act. They say an election, quote, an election cannot be free or fair if every eligible voter is not given a full chance to vote, or if the law exists that make it harder for them to do so. Michael Dell basically said, quote, those rights, especially for women, communities of color, have been hard-earned. Government should ensure citizens have their voices heard. HB 6 does the opposite, and we're opposed to it. PayPal, an organization, quote, the passage of the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act of 2021 is pending now in the United States Senate and will be an important step towards making free and fair access to voting a reality for all. These are all corporations who know the importance of doing business in the United States, the importance of a democracy, and they got to be scared about what they're seeing. They got people coming up on stages in rallies all over the United States basically saying, I will overturn the 2020 election. Do you think people want to do businesses in countries like that? No, people want to do business in stable countries where you have a free and fair election and you keep going. That's the beauty of the democracy. The people have spoken, as I talked about earlier. Microsoft, they're really trying to rally everybody. Quote, we hope that companies will come together and make it clear that a healthy business requires a healthy community. A healthy community requires that everyone have the right to vote conveniently, safely, and securely. So they obviously get it. They know what this is about. Salesforce, another organization, they basically have said, as voting rights have come under attack in places like Georgia and Texas, we have used our platform to advocate for the right to vote based on nonpartisan principles and action. Let's go the Greater Phoenix GPL leadership. Disenfranchising voters is not election reform. These efforts are misguided and must be defeated. And this was in an op-ed opposing Arizona Senate Bill 1485, 1593, and 1713. And it was signed by 50 Arizona business leaders. The reason I'm saying this is because these businesses right now are leading the charge on efforts to try to stop these voter suppression tactics in states. And they're trying to tell us, hey, you guys do the same thing here, please. You guys please join the effort and do the same thing here, please. There's another, well, Coca-Cola, I think they've been pretty clear, although we should see what they say. This is a statement on Georgia's voting legislation. They say, we want to be crystal clear and state unambiguously that we are disappointed in the outcome of Georgia's voting legislation. Our focus is now supporting federal legislation that protects voting access and addresses the voter suppression across the country. Major League Baseball, they've been pretty clear on this. There's been quite a debate about this. Happened, you know, I don't know what's going to happen, Madam President, this week. I don't know what's going to happen. But I know when we raised questions about the Washington football team and spoke directly to the team, we said, this is the wrong approach. You need to change. I said, well, we don't want to. In the end, the business community, supported by many Native American organizations, the business community told the Washington team it was time to change. So the business community is telling us here, do not suppress the rights of voters in the United States of America. So we may not be successful here, but I guarantee you the business community will continue to be loud about this because they know that voter suppressions and undermining democracy is undermining healthy communities here in the United States. So Major League Baseball fundamentally supports the rights for all Americans and opposes restrictions at the ballot box. And the Black Economic Alliance. This was a statement on the Georgia voting legislation signed by 72 Black economic and business leaders. Quote, while the use of police dog, poll taxes, literary tests, and other overtly racist voter suppression tactics are a thing of the past, Georgia and other states are rushing to impose new and substantial burdens on voting laws following an election that produced record turnout for both parties. The disproportionate racial impact of these allegedly, quote, neutral laws should neither be overlooked nor excused. The stakes for our democracy are too high to remain silent or on the sidelines. So, Madam President, all of these organizations I want to just end with one last one, the Civic Alliance. The Civic Alliance is an organization, I guess, signed by 1,200 member companies that basically said, quote, if our government is going to work for us, for all of us, each of us must have equal freedom to vote, and elections must reflect the will of the people. We cannot elect leaders in every state capital and Congress to work across the aisle We call on elected leaders in every capital and in Congress to work across the aisle, ensure that every eligible American has the freedom to easily cast their ballot and participate fully in our democracy. So these are the statements of people who are ringing the bell of concerns about voter suppression across the United States of America. These are the people who are saying it's time for us to act. They're not saying figure it out in a few years. They're not saying this is something you can deal with later. They're asking us to act now. Usually the business community doesn't get that involved in stating legislation by House and Senate bill numbers. They usually don't do that. They're usually a little more reticent. They're not reticent now because they know doing business in a democracy is way better than in some scenario of voter suppression. So I asked my colleagues to join us in getting this done. I see my colleague, who's been the leader on this effort overall, the senator from Minnesota, and I thank her for her leadership on this issue. This has been a hard-fought battle and something that she has put a lot of energy into, and I just want to personally thank her for that leadership and continuing to fight this fight. Madam President, I yield the floor.
Madam President,
The senior senator from Minnesota.
I first want to thank my colleague from the state of Washington, Senator Cantwell, for her passion for the people and the rights of people to vote, and her willingness to actually go through the details of the groups outside of this Congress that feel so strongly about this, including businesses, as pointed out, who understand that you can't do business overseas, having just come back from Ukraine, that I just arrived an hour ago, and uphold democracies overseas if we are allowing our democracy to go to shambles by allowing voter suppression laws to pass as they have in numerous states across the country. Just this week, we marked the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And today, we are considering legislation that goes to the very heartbeat of the democracy, the freedom to vote, that so many have fought and died for. We're here because a flood of state laws to roll back voting has surged up since the 2020 elections. And when in the 2020 elections, in the middle of a pandemic, Americans cast a ballot, more of them cast a ballot than ever before. They were willing to take those risks, and the laws were changed in red states and blue states and purple states to allow them to do that. But now what do we see? A rollback in the presiding officer's great state of Wisconsin. We see rollbacks attempted across the nation in places like Montana, same-day registration in place for 15 years. 8,000 people took avail of it in the last election to either change their address or register that way. So then what happens? Well, say the Republican legislature in Montana, why don't we get rid of something we've had in place for 15 years? Why don't we do that? Guess what that creates, my friends? Maximum confusion and ultimate voter suppression. With that core freedom of voting now at stake, it is on us to stand up, to take up the torch that Dr. King and so many brave Americans carried decades ago and act to preserve the foundational right of our democracy. And while that may sound like an ambitious task, it is one within our reach. By passing the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act, we can meet these challenges and turn back the tide. Today, I want to address a topic that has loomed large over this historic debate, and that has to do with the very rules of this chamber. This week, every member of the Senate will have a chance to cast a vote that will determine if this is a legislative body that will rise to meet a test. The test is participation and voting. The test is actually being able to take on the issues of our day. It won't be the first time. Indeed, 4 times already this Congress, our Republican colleagues have blocked us from even considering legislation to protect the freedom to vote. But we're here again this week. We're here because, to quote Ella Baker, a granddaughter of slaves from Virginia who worked alongside some of the great leaders of the civil rights movement, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. So while much has been made of our colleagues who have not committed to joining us in this effort to change the Senate rules, we must remain steadfast in the truth that the right to vote in this country is not negotiable. We must forge ahead. I want to start by responding to some of the points that have been raised as reasons not to move forward with legislation at this watershed moment, as reason not to do what it takes to come to protecting the most sacred of rights, the right to vote. Some have argued that allowing voting rights legislation to pass the Senate without clearing a 60-vote threshold would be a mistake that would open the door to somehow leading to wild swings in federal policy. I'm trying to imagine this place ever involved in such a thing, given how slowly we go and how many people understandably want to make sure we're careful in how we pass laws, but that's one of the things that have been raised for why we need some kind of a 60-vote threshold, which of course is not in the Constitution. The word filibuster, a cloture, not in the Constitution. And in fact, legislatures across this land, some of whom do very good things, do not use a 60-vote threshold. In fact, democracies across the world do not use a 60-vote threshold. The truth is this: we have tried for months to persuade our Republican colleagues to join us in supporting legislation, to work with us, to debate it. But what they do is they throw a wrench into the process and then basically walk out that door and go home. We don't have that debate that allows us to have amendments and allows us to ultimately have a vote on the bill. It is cut off from a vote. When you look at the past when it comes to voting rights, it has been bipartisan not even that long ago. But this time, even reauthorizing the Voting Rights Act, something that has been law of the land, supported on a bipartisan basis that the President of the United States pointed out when he was in Atlanta, this time, no. Only one Republican, Senator Murkowski of Alaska, was willing even to allow the John Lewis bill to come up for a vote. But if our colleagues across the aisle will not work with us, it cannot mean that we should simply give up. A simple look at history makes that clear. As Representative Clyburn has noted in recent weeks, there have been moments in our history when this most fundamental of rights has not been extended or defended on a bipartisan basis. That's a right to have these bills come up. He pointed to the 15th Amendment, that, as he said, was a single-party vote that gave black people the right to vote. And that fact does not make the 15th Amendment any less legitimate. I would also say to my colleagues that the real threat facing our country isn't too much legislation, it's the gridlock and the stalemate in which this chamber is stuck. A number of us were just in Ukraine, standing up for democracy, standing up for the right of people across the world to be able to debate issues and make decisions on the most pressing issues of this time. And now we are back here in this chamber. And we have to have that opportunity as well. This misses another key point in the arguments made against changing the rules. When politicians actually have to vote on stuff, voters can hold them accountable for these votes. We know that the policies in the Freedom to Vote John R. Lewis Act enjoy strong support among the American people. They've been adopted in red and blue and purple states. Look at places like Utah. For years, mail-in balloting. Yet in other states, sadly, it's really hard to do. In other states, you have to get a notary just to get an application, or you have to get a witness just to get an application, even if you have COVID and you're in a hospital. But yet, in many states, red, blue, purple, this is in place. We believe, those of us that support the Freedom to Vote Act, that in keeping with the Constitution that says that Congress can make or alter the laws regarding federal elections, that this should be the law of the land. It is constitutionally supported, and Americans, no matter what their zip code, should have the right to vote in a safe way that's best for them. Arguing the Senate rules are more important than the right to vote ignores the very history of this nation. As Senator Angus King has reminded us, in 1890, Henry Cabot Lodge introduced a bill to ensure African Americans in the South were not disenfranchised. The bill passed the House, but was blocked by the Senate with a filibuster. Lodge argued that the Senate should get rid of the filibuster, saying, To vote without debating is perilous, but to debate and never vote is imbecile. I think that kind of says it all quite directly. The Senate chose not to change its rules, and due to repeated filibusters in the years that followed, Congress couldn't pass legislation to enforce the 15th Amendment until nearly 70 years later through the Civil Rights Act of 1957. We've also heard that allowing one party to insist on virtually unlimited debates so you can't vote is an essential part of the Senate. But experts from both parties have said this isn't true. As Marty Gold, a respected expert on the Senate rules who worked for Republican leader Howard Baker and was staff director of the Senate Rules Committee, has written, the possibility that a minority of senators could hold unlimited debate on a topic against the majority's will was unknown in the first Senate. Those are his words. Others have argued that requiring a supermajority, as this filibuster does now, to pass legislation was an intentional effort to foster compromise. But again, the historical record simply doesn't back that up. The Constitutional Convention heard but did not adopt a proposal to require a supermajority for legislation. The framers explicitly decided to reserve supermajority requirements for things like constitutional amendments, treaties, and impeachment. To quote one of them, Benjamin Franklin wrote that a system where the minority overpowers the majority would be contrary to the common practice of assemblies in all countries and ages. Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter to James Madison, "It is my principle that the will of the majority should always prevail." James Madison was a fierce defender of minority rights, but in 1834, even he wrote, "The vital principle of Republican government is the will of the majority." Listening to those words, does it really seem like the framers of our Constitution envisioned a system where a minority of senators could stand in the way of legislation and stop it altogether, stop the vote, stop the consideration, throw a wrench into a process, take it off the rails, and then just walk out the door and go home? That is not what they envisioned. I also want to be clear. Updating the Senate rules to meet the needs of this moment isn't some radical break with past precedent. Throughout the Senate's history, when faced with unrelenting obstruction from the minority, the majority has in fact changed the Senate rules to allow matters to conclude, to be voted on, not to hang in abeyance in perpetuity. In fact, since it was first established in 1917, the cloture rule has been revised multiple times to make it easier to end debate and to force a vote. Now, for friends watching at home, this is what it means. A cloture motion is what allows senators to bring something to a vote. And under the current rules, it takes 60 senators to open debate to pass a bill. Here are some examples of how the cloture rule has changed over time. In 1949, cloture was extended to cover all issues pending before the Senate, not just bills. In 1975, the vote threshold for cloture was reduced to 3/5 of all senators. In 1979, total post-cloture debate was limited to 100 hours, and then it was limited again to 30 hours in 1986. And in the past decade, the cloture rule has been further reduced for various kinds of nominees, most recently by our Republican colleagues across the aisle. This isn't something from 100 years ago. This isn't something from before we had cars and people were arriving here on horseback. This just happened. In addition to changes to the cloture rule itself, the Senate has put in place exceptions to the rule. In fact, over time, the Senate has established over 160 processes in statute that allow a final vote without requiring 60 votes for cloture to end debate. In other words, you get to a vote without the 60 votes. As a result, we have expedited procedures, including, get this, reconciliation to pass spending and tax legislation, the Congressional Review Act to block regulations, disapproval of arms sales. I guess someone decided that was okay to do for less than 60 votes. Even approving compensation plans for commercial space accidents doesn't require 60 votes, my friends. But while the 60-vote threshold was carved up 160 times so senators could pass things like tax cuts under President Trump, block regulations, and confirm Supreme Court justices, when it comes to voting rights, we are told that traditions and comedy means that we should hug it tight, this old rule, throw voters under the Senate desk, and go home. It's no wonder that our Republican colleagues' support for the 60-vote threshold rings hollow when their priorities, such as tax cuts, such as a Supreme Court nominee, can be passed with a simple majority. Time and time again, the majority in the U.S. Senate has had to change the rules to help pass major legislation. As Senator Merkley has noted time and time again, bills we have passed after the majority has modified the rules include the Natural Gas Policy Act in 1977, funding for the Selective Service System in 1980, deficit reduction legislation in 1985, a moratorium on listing new species under the Endangered Species Act in 1995, and a change made by the majority in 1996 to the reconciliation process, which paved the way for the 2001 and 2003 Bush tax cuts and 2017 Trump tax cuts. When circumstances change, senators have changed the rules time and time again. All of this history clearly shows that the Senate rules are not chiseled in stone. That's probably a good thing, because we get that the people out there need us to do our jobs, and that maybe that's more important than some archaic rule that someone is now abusing. They are not an outside force, these rules over which we have no control. They are our rules, the senators' rules, yes, but also the people's rules, written and changed over the years by senators representing the people of this country, just like the ones sitting in this chamber today. As we move forward, I want to make clear that I agree with my colleagues who have said we must keep the history of this institution in mind. By the way, I just gave you the history of this institution. 160 carve-outs, time and time again when the rules have changed. That is the true history of this institution. History plainly allows for just the type of action that our democracy now demands. If we acknowledge the stakes when it comes to protecting the freedom to vote, the cornerstone of our democracy, and we acknowledge the history of the rules of this body, I am left with a simple conclusion. We must update, change, and improve our rules to restore the Senate and meet the moment of our times. Our nation was founded on the ideals of democracy, and we've seen for ourselves in this building how we can't afford to take that for granted. I certainly saw that this weekend in Ukraine. We cannot afford to take any democracy for granted. The world is watching us, watching to see how America is taking on the challenges of the 21st century, including the threats to our democracy. Around the globe, there are those who see weakness in our opportunity. They see it, weakness in our democracy, as an opportunity for them. Those who are hoping that gridlock and paralysis are the defining features of America. They are out there, and you can imagine what world leaders I am thinking of right now. To put it simply, if we're going to effectively compete with the rest of the world, we need a Senate that can do more than just respond to crises. We're pretty good at that. Tornadoes, hurricanes, floods, tsunamis, financial crises, pandemics, okay, we respond to that. But what about those long-term challenges, like slowly but surely eroding this democracy with voter suppression? There is so much at stake here. We must get this done. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor. Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that following the remarks of Senator Portman in the Senate, recess until 6:15 p.m. And thank you. We've now had a new president. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you.
Without objection. Mr. President. Senator from Ohio. Mr. President, I was asked recently what I think is the #1 issue facing America. It's a tough question. I had a lot of issues race through my mind: inflation, the debt, workforce issues, the crisis at our southern border, the explosion of COVID cases, the deadly opioid epidemic, a warming planet, Russia and China flexing their muscles and creating more volatility around the world. We've got plenty of challenges, don't we? But you know what I landed on, what I think is our biggest problem? It's the increasing division, even polarization of our politics and our country. It's what makes it so hard to address all those other issues that I named that are so important to the families who we represent. Last week on the Senate floor, my Democratic colleague from Arizona, Senator Sinema, called it a disease of division. Well put. When we're together, this country can achieve great things, and has over the years. It can provide a beacon of hope to a troubled world. But as Lincoln warned, a house divided against itself cannot stand. In this body, we should be figuring out how to come together to help America stand and stand strong to address our many challenges. That's why I'm so discouraged by what I see playing out on the U.S. Senate floor again this week. I see an attempt by Democratic leadership to fan the flames of distrust. I see an attempt to further divide an already splintered country, both by exaggerated arguments being made to advance controversial legislation opposed by every single Republican regarding the tough issue of voting, and then to try to achieve this purely partisan objective by changing a foundation of the Senate to dismantle the one Senate rule, the legislative filibuster, that works to bring us together rather than pull us apart. Equally troubling to me is that this seems to be a purely political exercise now, in that the conclusion seems predetermined. Apparently, the Senate is being dragged through this divisive and ugly partisan debate, knowing that it will not achieve a legislative result, but only a deepening and hardening of the political lines in each camp. Here in the Senate, most Republicans and most Democrats say they want to bring the country together. I think they're sincere about that. This message was an explicit part of President Biden's campaign for president. Yet there is nothing about the harsh partisan rhetoric from the president's speech on this topic in Atlanta last week, or much of the floor debate this week and last week, that does anything but push our country further apart. First, the substance of the legislative fight. Democrats have been highly critical of those Republicans who refused to accept the results of the 2020 election, pointing out accurately that dozens of lawsuits failed to show adequate fraud to change the result. They have attacked some Republicans because they had said that the election was rigged, for questioning the state-by-state certification process that has led to deeper rifts in our nation, and a significant number of Republican voters questioning the legitimacy of the election. I get that. So why now are Democratic leaders and President Biden using the exact same language, literally saying the elections are rigged? Literally saying that. Why are they perpetrating their own election narrative that does not fit the facts, but serves to push both sides deeper into their own camps? And in particular, now leads Democrats to think elections are illegitimate. Majority Leader Schumer claims, and I quote, Republicans are pushing voter suppression and election nullification laws. President Biden has compared state efforts to tighten up election administration to Jim Crow laws, compared Republicans to notorious racists in our history. These attacks are overwrought, exaggerated, and deeply divisive. Here's what the nonpartisan and respected group called No Labels has said about the Democratic attacks, and I quote, if you dig into these state legislative proposals, you'll find most entail tightening up procedures pertaining to registration, mail and absentee voting, and voter ID laws that were loosened in 2020 in the name of making it safer for people to vote amid COVID pandemic. Many leading Democrats and liberal commentators have taken to describing these measures as Jim Crow 2.0, which is to say they are somehow worse than the original Jim Crow era, which entailed poll taxes and literacy tests, violent intimidation of black voters by the KKK, and even outright prohibition on black voters participating in party primaries in southern states. To suggest that any voting measures being debated today in America are somehow worse than this is simply irresponsible demagoguery. End quote. That comes from No Labels, which is a nonpartisan group, Democrats and Republicans, trying to find that middle ground. Now, to be fair, this group has been critical of Republican claims of widespread election fraud that cannot be backed up. So what are the actual facts? First, the Constitution guarantees all citizens 18 years of age or older the right to vote in elections regardless of race or gender, period. The Federal Voting Rights Act reaffirms that right and makes it enforceable in federal court. In 2006, Congress voted in a bipartisan way to reauthorize this important law for 25 years through 2031. I voted for and strongly support the Voting Rights Act and have long supported other common sense efforts to increase voter confidence in our elections. In fact, there is a bipartisan effort underway right now to deal with a real problem, to ensure that after the fact, certified elections are respected. This will require making overdue reforms to the Electoral Count Act and some other reasonable updates to federal election procedures. I'm happy to be working with a small group of Senate Democrats and Senate Republicans on those efforts. That's how the system should work. We're not going to agree on everything, but we can sit down and talk and find common ground to address problems. What Republicans and most Americans don't support is an unprecedented federal takeover of our election system, which is what the overly broad party line bills proposed this week by the Democrats will do. Let me be clear. Despite what Democratic leaders are saying to jam these bills through Congress, our democracy is not, as they say, in crisis because it is too hard to vote. We just had a national election in 2020 with the highest voter turnout in 120 years. 94% of voters said it was easy for them to vote. This is according to the Pew Research Center, 94%. That's good. Some have said drastic changes are needed at the federal level because the states are now enacting voter restrictions. Some point to the liberal Brennan Center, which reports that 19 states have enacted laws which it characterizes as restricting the right to vote. As noted above, again by the nonpartisan No Labels group, when you really look at these laws, the truth is that they largely make modest changes in election law administration, such as the date that voters may apply for mail-in ballots, or ensuring voters who say they are who they are through voter ID and other signature requirements, something, by the way, the vast majority of Americans support. Some of the laws return to state practices closer to the status quo before the pandemic. As an example, some laws reduce the number of ballot drop boxes in cases where there were no ballot drop boxes before COVID. And many of the states the Democrats criticize for improving their election process are enacting laws similar to those that have long been in place in states represented by Democrats, so-called blue states. For example, under its new law, Georgia has a limit of 17 days of in-person early voting, 17 days. New Jersey and New York have 9 days of in-person voting. Connecticut doesn't have any early voting. Georgia has also added one extra Saturday of early voting. Georgia's new requirement that voters provide their driver's license or state ID numbers when applying for mail-in ballots, which Democrats have criticized, is the same as laws in Maryland and Pennsylvania. Rhode Island enacted a voter ID law a decade ago. And with regard to President Biden's home state, The Atlantic has noted that, quote, few states have more limited voting options than Delaware, end quote. I frankly have not heard Democratic leadership calling out any of these Democrat majority states for pushing what they deem to be voter suppression. I don't know anyone who doesn't believe it should be easy to vote and hard to cheat. Every state has to find that balance, but they have to find it while not violating the Voting Rights Act. I don't agree with every policy every state has in place. I find some too restrictive. As an example, I support no-fault absentee voting as we do in Ohio. It works well. You don't have to have a reason, you can vote absentee. I'd like to see every mailbox, in a sense, be a ballot box, in essence. I find that some of the laws in some of the states lack adequate security, on the other hand. For example, I think some form of ID is smart, as do the vast majority of Americans. But in our federal system, within the guardrails of the Voting Rights Act and consistent with the Constitution, that decision is left up to state legislatures, closer to the people and accountable to the voters. That's just a fundamental philosophical difference we have here on the Senate floor. We see it play out on lots of issues, and now on this one. I'm very proud of the job that my state of Ohio and our bipartisan election officials in every county do in our elections. In the last election, we had a record 5.97 million Ohioans cast a vote, more voters than ever. It represented 74% of eligible voters in our state, the second highest percentage in the history of Ohio. Despite the challenges of running the highest turnout election in our state's history during an unprecedented pandemic, it was widely regarded as the most secure and most successful Ohio election ever. Now is not the time to take the responsibility away from Ohio state and local officials. Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution clearly assigns that authority over elections to the states. Alexander Hamilton acknowledged in Federalist 59 that only in extraordinary circumstances should the federal government become involved in election law, explaining that allowing the federal government to run elections would have been a, quote, premeditated engine for the destruction of state governments, end quote. We are not in extraordinary circumstances right now. In general, it's become easier and easier to vote in America, and that's a good thing. And it's become easier to vote in America than many other democracies around the world, and that's good too. Easy to vote, hard to cheat. Despite all the fiery speeches on the floor stating the contrary over the past week, according to a recent survey from Morning Consult, only 33% of American adults think it's too hard for eligible voters to vote. A larger share, 44%, actually think current rules aren't strict enough. Having heard the debate, this is what voters think. Not only are Democrats attempting a federal takeover of our election system, but because they have chosen to change the constitutionally based election system in a purely partisan way, they don't have the 60 votes necessary to get something passed here in the United States Senate. That's why instead of reaching out to find a bipartisan way forward, they are also proposing to fundamentally change the long-standing rules of the Senate. Specifically, they are proposing to do away with what's called the legislative filibuster in order to advance their federal election takeover bills by a simple majority instead of the normal 60 votes. This 60-vote margin, the legislative filibuster, is the one tool left to encourage bipartisanship, not just here in the Senate, but in our system, in the House, at the White House. Yes, it provides important minority rights in the Senate that protect the country from legislation that is too far out of the mainstream, and it helps pass good legislation, like Medicare or Social Security, with big votes, big margins. It means those programs can be sustained and they can be relied upon. That's good for our country. Most importantly to me, the legislative filibuster is the one thing that encourages us to work in a bipartisan way. The successful passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law last year is a good example. I was in the middle of those negotiations. We knew we had to achieve 60 votes in a 50-50 Senate. What did that mean? That meant that we had to find common ground. We had to make concessions on both sides in order to get to 60 votes. As a result, we got well over 60, into the 70s, and a good piece of legislation that was able to pass the House and be signed into law and is now in place again, as sustainable, reliable legislation. Did I agree with everything in it? No, nor did anybody else. But to get to those 60 votes,